Welcome to the Divine Council Worldview podcast. In this episode, we're going to be beginning in Genesis 6. We might get to the end of we will. Let's get to the end of the flood. Let's take the story of Genesis 6 through 9 as one piece of the narrative of the Old Testament. We're not going to read through the entire the entire flood incident. You can certainly do that on your own time, but let's overview it and talk about it again from a Divine Council Worldview standpoint. We're not here to study every verse for its own sake as much as ask the question, what would a Divine Council worldview ask of a text, and how would it interpret a text, and so forth. And obviously, when it comes to Divine Council issues, Genesis 6 has gotten has earned its level of importance and earned a reputation. So certainly interesting text. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing well. It's been an interesting week or so.
Yeah, we just had Valentine's Day, and what did we do? We found a restaurant downtown Minneapolis, and we were able to enjoy that. So we've always made a big thing of Valentine's Day, and I'm glad because I grew up never thinking about. I mean, I never dated in high school, never really dated in college, and so when I got married, I realized what a big thing Valentine's Day even was. It had never occurred to me. So just as important for a married couple as it is for anybody else.
Yeah.
All right. 6:1. We did this last time. We introduced Genesis 6, and let's do it again just to get our bearings. We come out of 5 with the family of Noah. The importance of the genealogy is that you can go back from Noah and find Adam. And this will be Luke 3's point that backwards, in other words, if you go to the end of Luke 3, it ends with Adam and it begins with Jesus. In our story, we're beginning with Adam and ending with Noah, chapter 5. And the importance, of course, of Noah is that he's the principal agent human in the flood story and the cause of the flood. Now, there are various things that I think we have to get out of Genesis 6, 1-4 as a Divine Council reader. And one would be, and respond, Mike, as you will here, unless we take Genesis 6, 1-4 as a Divine Council issue or divine beings getting involved with mankind, we are going to miss out on why the flood. In other words, the flood doesn't happen because people are bad. And often people will look at verse 5, the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth. I've heard that verse used, to argue for depravity and so forth and so on. And just that, God looks at the earth and says, I don't like bad things. I don't like bad behavior. And if behavior gets bad enough, I'll wipe them off the earth. Saying it that way overlooks the whole point of 1-4. So I suspect you would agree that when it comes to Divine Council issues, bringing divine beings into the story is a necessity. Otherwise, the whole flood narrative really makes no sense.
I agree. I think it's less of an issue of either or and more of an and both. Because, I've heard folks as well that they would overemphasize in some sense, verses 1-4, and then downplay the wickedness of humanity.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so as though the only reason for the flood was because of what happened in verses 1-4. It's like, that's the only reason. And then downplay the wickedness of man. And I think in reality, you have to take verses 1-5, and it's really an and both situation.
Yeah. In fact, let's do that because as I ended last time, and let me do it here when I go starting with verse 1. I'll repeat that idea. Thank you for that because I think it's part of it. When men begin to multiply, verse 1, on the face of the land, daughters are born to them. The sons of God, I take that to be divine beings, just a way of saying beings which are of a divine class, sons of. Okay, so divine beings saw that the daughters of man, there's the other side of creation, the physical side. So you've got a divine side and a physical side, playing off, as you said last time, this idea of seeing and being attracted to or finding good in something. God saw his creation and said it was good. Eve saw the tree and liked it. Now, literarily, there's a moment where we see a repeated idea that divine beings look down, as it were, and see human women, and they find them attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. I would recommend that means more than, and probably not even just a rape of some kind, but there's a human divine interaction that because we are made in the image of divine beings, we're able to relate to them, 126, and that relationship can also play out both directions, so that as these divine beings take these women, as it were, take these divine beings. And you have an early example of what we'll call later demonization in the New Testament. Demon possessed is a long way of saying in English what the Greek will say is just demonized. And I would recommend that here you have an example of that, where these women are worshiping probably these divine beings, and there's a relationship between them, even down to the level of having offspring. I know that's weird, but we have to take this story, as we said last time, this is one of those stories that everybody knew, and that's why the brevity with which it's told is stunning to us. We'd like to have more information, what percentage of the sons of God, or were they evil? Had they rebelled before this point? So forth and so on. We just don't have answers, but the text gives us enough to know that we have divine beings having relationship with humans to the point of having offspring. Verse 3, the Lord said, my spirit, or my presence, or my approval, you can kind of take that as a appositional idea of God himself and his approving spirit, shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days will be 120 years. The New King James says, not strive with man forever. Most take verse 3 to mean, I'm going to give this situation 120 more years to go. That's usually how it's taken. You could take it to mean, I'm not going to let men live over 120 years at a time. That's kind of where when you come off the ark, Abraham will live stunningly shorter lifespan than his predecessors, and I've seen a chart where after the flood, lifespans are remarkably shorter, and maybe that's what it means, but we're not sure if 6.3 means I'm going to set the timer for 120 years, and then there's going to be a cataclysm, or whether all humans will not live past 120. We do have numerous people who live past 120. That's why maybe that's not the easiest way to take it.
I think it was John Goldingay's commentary where he also proposed that similar idea that essentially a time clock has begun.
Okay.
That we got about 120 something odd years before judgment is about to happen based on what's occurring. This is obviously, this is basically God is saying in verse 3, this whole entire circumstance, this situation that's happening here right now, this can't keep on happening. And so there is almost like this ticking time clock that's ticking down towards when final judgment will happen. So that was his concept of how to take it, because he also saw the other way of interpreting it. You then hit other problems where there are people who live past 120 years.
Right. All right, 6:4 is the famous verse. And the Nephilim. Now that word in Hebrew, as you see there at the bottom, nephal, it's a derivative of the word to fall. So that could either be fallen from the heavens, some people think, or fallen in the sense of evil. We're not told. The Nephilim, that's that word there in Hebrew. Notice in the ESV is just transliterated from the Hebrew. In the New King James, we get giants. So how do you want to translate it is a good question. The only other time this word occurs in the Hebrew text is and here are the two times thus, it occurs 3 times total, but 2 verses, once in Genesis 6:4. And then you go to the Joshua genocide story. Well, before Joshua takes over the army, the 12 spies go into the land. There it is, Numbers 13:33. And the 12 spies come back after looking through Canaan, and they say, here it is, they saw the Nephilim, And then in parenthesis, the sons of Anak, or the descendants of Anak, come from the Nephilim. And we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. The point being, there is these huge humans in Canaan that we're afraid of. And these are the 12 best soldiers they had, and they're even saying we felt like we were grasshoppers compared to them. So the point is, we have a verse or a word like Nephilim that by itself is used so rarely, it's hard to know what it means. It does seem to have the implication of a giant. And so it's translated, I believe, into Latin as gigantus, or is that the Greek? I forget. But
actually, can I bring up something that Mike had Dr. Heiser had brought up in his Unseen Realm book?
Yeah.
So this is I think this is on page 107 in his Unseen Realm book. And he goes into, typically a lot of people assume Nephilim is coming from, a root word that means fall, or, so then folks will assume that it probably is pointing to the idea of fallen ones. He went down a different trajectory. He's including other Mesopotamian type of ideas and stories. And so his conclusion at the end of this was, my view, quote, is that to solve this messaging problem, the Jewish scribes adopted an Aramaic noun, Nephalilah, which means, quote, giants. When you import the word and pluralize it for Hebrew, you get Nephilim, just what we see in Numbers 13:33. This is the only explanation to the meaning of the word that accounts for all the context and all the details.
Yeah, I'm reading along with you in my version of Unseen Realm.
Yeah. I think like Mike, it was like Dr. Heiser was the only one that I noticed who actually went to comparing other cognate languages, especially Aramaic. And since that was a common dialect, or a common language of the time when probably Genesis was compiled in the end to what its final form is, there's a good argument, it seems, that it might actually be coming from the Aramaic word that means giants, which might explain why later on the Septuagint, the Greek version, and then the Latin versions are basically just taking their cue from the Septuagint to just translate the word as giants. Yep.
For our listening audience, it's Unseen Realm pages 108 and 109. Give Mike's well thought through background for Nephilim, because it, as he says in 108, there is no noun Nephilim in Hebrew. In other words, it's almost like they made up a word there in 6:4. And the easiest answer would be that they're dealing with, because especially if we're dealing with a Torah that is edited and redacted into the Babylonian period, which it likely was, Aramaic is the lingua franca of Babylon. And so the idea that Nephilim as a word is imported back into the text is very likely. So
and it's part of the reason why the Targums were created, and just how within a generation of being in exile in Babylon, you had a whole entire new generation of folks who essentially lost the ability to read or speak fluent Hebrew.
Right.
And thus why we eventually get the scribal notations for what vowels were supposed to be at where consonants were, because they intuitively knew when they saw the original words what to say, just like how we can do it in English. You remove all the vowels from a sentence. We intuitively can actually just fill in all the vowels. I've seen
examples of that. It's fascinating how we can do it.
Yeah. But then if you are not exposed to that language and read that on a regular basis, then over time you just lose the story. You lose the script. And so eventually, the scribes came up with the innovation of adding little markers to indicate this is the kind of vowel sound you make with this consonant. And it was necessary because people just slowly forgot how to actually read and speak Hebrew.
Yeah. Hebrew will be a dead language for many, many centuries. It was rebirthed, of course, in the Zionistic movement of the 1800s. And so now when you go to Israel, biblical Hebrew, well, it's called modern Hebrew, but you have many similarities, because modern Hebrew is based so squarely on biblical Hebrew because of the deadness of it for centuries at a time. But back to it here, 6:4, the Nephilim. So again, as we've been saying, this story is being told by the writer in a sense of, hey, we all know it, so let me just kind of position the story in the bigger picture of the flood. So you know where the story fits in the flood story.
Mm-hmm.
So he says in 6:4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. I take it to mean that 120-year period where the daughters of men and the sons of God were cohabiting. Coming out of their union were children that were called giants or Nephilim, and they were there in those days. And notice that little phrase, I put it in yellow because I think it's very important, and also afterwards. So the writer speaking, if it's Moses, if he said that line, that would be his way of saying, guys, that's why we have our spies that just came back in Numbers 13 and said they're still there, right? So I think that afterward statement is how you get Numbers 13:33 to make sense, that they were here before the flood and they're going to be in the days of Joshua as well. And to clarify, he says, when the sons of God, the divine beings, came into the daughters of man and they bore children to them. And then this line again just kind of positions the story in an otherwise well-known tale. These were the mighty men who were of old the men of renown, the famous men that every Jewish child grew up hearing about. This is where they came from. Now, what does a divine council worldview require from this story, or give us options to think about? My personal view, Mike, would be the idea that divine beings and humans can cohabit is taught here, or at least allowed for. It certainly means that divine beings and human beings can relate to each other, that this is the background for how we get demonic possession, that this is the background for the worship of the wrong God question again, that we're having an involvement with beings that, as the story positions it, it shouldn't have happened. This is a bad thing. My spirit will not take this much longer, God says. So we have to have that at least. Where I would say there are options involved would be, does this constitute a rebellion among the divine world? Maybe. I know Mike often thought of it as the second of three rebellions. He had 1 in 3, 6, 1 in 3, 1 in 6, and then another in 11. And that's possible. I don't sense for myself that I need to have a rebellion here as much as spirits who either already were disloyal or became disloyal, I don't know, were involved. Is that fair enough? Do you see where I'm going there?
I think you're trying to provide some space to not just come down on a assuming what their intentions were completely.
Right. We don't know their intention. I would suspect that God is sensing it as an involved. Well, let's go to Jude and 2 Peter. Here's where we can easily take a second or a New Testament passage and lay it backwards on top of this. 2 Peter 2:4. And again, I'm always nervous to bring a text that's later backwards into a story, but for sake of what Peter is saying, he's recalling something and using it as an example of something happening in his present day, right? Mm-hmm. So 2 Peter 2:4, if God did not spare the angeloi who sinned. Angeloi does not mean angel, as I've argued. It means divine being. And it has been transliterated into angel in our Bible and thus given us a category called angel that the Bible knows nothing about. It's interesting that in some of the Greek or the codexes, the main codex of the Septuagint for Genesis 6:4, they have crossed out the word Elohim and put angelos or angeloi. So Genesis 6:4 reads literally, or 6:2 it would be, instead of saying the sons of Elohim, they crossed off the whole sons of Elohim and simply wrote the angeloi, saw that the daughters of man. That's in the Greek Septuagint in one of the versions.
Yes.
Which shows that even early on, 200 BC, they were willing, or at least ready to play with this idea that I can switch out B'nai Elohim, however that would work in Greek, and just put one word to capture the idea, angeloi. But again, to just say, well, those are angels, to me is misunderstanding the story, because you've got to get, divine beings here that are going to qualify for the first commandment, so forth and so on. So
I think that's it's a natural outpouring of what happens with language, right? People create these mental shortcuts, and they distill down a meaning that was a lot more nuanced, and then eventually they just generalize it. And so I think, unfortunately, like angeloi was a very specific kind of category, and then over time it just became, in common layman terms, a shortcut to just say a spiritual being.
Very well said. Yeah. That's why I don't like the term angel. It's too much of a shortcut. It cuts off so much biblical thinking. So back to 2:4 of 2 Peter. If God did not spare the angeloi who sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. That's in the book of Enoch. And did not spare the ancient world, but save Noah. See, now there, and Mike was all over this too. When Peter says the angeloi who sinned, if it's not this group, well, then who is it? I mean, because he ties it right into Noah. So I would say that would be a good reason to say that these are angeloi who sinned. Yes, it does open the question of, is this a momentary rebellion? Is this something that happened because of maybe something tied back all the way to Genesis 3? I don't know. It doesn't matter to me as much, as to whether we can delineate a rebellion or a number of rebellions. But the point is that something happened bad here when it comes to the divine-human interrelationship. And God is going to do something he has never done before. He is actually going to start over. So let's go ahead and read it. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and I take it because of this Nephilim relationship, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This isn't a general statement of mankind. This is a specific issue dealing with that generation, that the behavior, the thoughts, the intents, where humans had descended, not just behaviorally, but mentally, emotionally, whatever. I think it's just trying to pack everything in here, had gotten to the point where God said, I'm willing, verse 6, it grieved him to his heart. He's willing to start over. So he says in verse 7, I will blot out humans, mankind, whom I've created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things. I mean, God even gets into that, which is interesting. And there's a lot of ways you could have started over, but he has a guy build a boat. So do you have any opinion as to why God killed all the animals too? I don't.
Well, I mean, I think if we're trying to stay within the text here in just how the Genesis writer or editors did this, we don't have the detail. It just seems to be indicating that it got so bad that it almost seemed like it would be a lot easier to start over or almost start over from it all. I remember, and we alluded to this, that there is a material called First Enoch or Enochian material. And I remember the first time I read that on my own, and it was from the Hermanian translation, which is like based on more of the latest discovered manuscripts from the Book of Enoch.
Okay.
And when it got to this incident, its version of this whole entire incident, it was interesting about how there was a lot of cannibalism, essentially, that was happening, of giants eating other giants, and not just eating other giants, but also eating human beings, eating all of the other physical creatures of creation. Like, essentially, they were a force of nature that was decreating.
Wow. Okay.
Like they essentially were consuming, like they were decreating through consumption. And it's essentially just consuming. In that process, they were destroying everything within their path. And so, obviously, it was written probably around the Second Temple period. We're talking about after the exile, and this is like an elaboration, not necessarily the scripture or breath of God. But it was interesting. They had this kind of concept of it got so bad that essentially you had decreation happening, but in a very randomized kind of way, right? Through a very consumeristic, self-consumption kind of way. And
Interesting.
And then God's kind of approaches, okay, if we're going to do decreation, I'll do decreation, but I'm going to do it my way.
I can show you decreation, yeah. Noah found favor, grace, chen, in the eyes of the Lord. Interesting, and this will be a New Testament concept to get there if we ever do, Mike, is that grace, and this is in Paul and the Gift by Barclay, grace is a word that has undergone a lot of Reformation definition, that God's riches at Christ's expense, and it's always, this, you don't deserve it, but God is kind enough to do it for you. Really, in the ancient world, Cain or charis in Greek had a reciprocal idea to it, that most people who found favor in someone's eyes, including God's, did it for a reason, or that there was a reason that God found favor or grace, or people found grace in the eyes of God. So it is a reciprocal idea, and here's why. He, I'm getting up to it. He was righteous. Where did I? Oh, there it is, right there in front of me.
Verse 9.
The next verse. These are the generations. Noah was a tzaddik man. I forget if this is the first use. I believe it is of tzaddik. What are we in? 6:9? Yeah, I think this is the first use of tzaddik in the Bible. And tzaddik is a word that, first time.
Yep.
That, has undergone a lot of discussion. Theological idea, righteousness. How do you get righteous? I would argue, again, this is maybe not a divine counsel idea, but it's certainly it fits my divine counsel worldview, that being righteous is simply a matter of worshiping the right God. And if we get that settled, then a person is righteous, even if he's not behaviorally perfect. Okay? And so I would recommend that what this text is saying is Noah finds favor in God's eyes among this world that's going into decreation through the Nephilim, or the effect of it upon the world. Here comes a story of a guy named Noah who is considered tzaddik, or proper with God, blameless, tamim. Again, blameless or perfect is the New King James, often has a mathematical, perfection idea. Nothing could be further from the truth. The word tamim just means mature, above board, something like that. It's where God wants you to be. So if you did a word study on tamim there in 6:9, which I again believe might even be the first use of that. Go ahead.
So if I bring this up, in one of the more modern Hebrew lexicons, Halet, it brings up this concept of, for Genesis 6:9, that it conveys the idea of complete, unscathed, intact. Yeah.
Whole. This is in red here is the English translation, gloss or translation of tamim in Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible, without blemish. So you bring a lamb that is perfect. Well, again, let's not talk mathematical perfection, but it's translatable when you get into the Psalms, for example, and I'm fast forwarding here. A blameless, perfect, blamelessly. I was blameless before him. I kept myself from my guilt. Psalm 18:23. Well, David's hardly a blameless person behaviorally, but David would have seen himself as a blameless person in the sense of never ceasing to worship the right deity. So again, I'm reading 6:9 this way. This is the story of Noah. He was a right man. He was right with Yahweh, blameless in his relationship to Yahweh. He was mature. He walked with, there's that same line again, walked with the God. There's an article in front of that. So he walks with Yahweh. Noah has 3 sons. We know their names. And here is interesting, verse 6:11. And you have alluded to it, Mike. Now the earth was corrupt. Again, if you look up the Hebrew behind corrupt, you get, I need to do it again here. Here it is. And this is in red, the word corrupt in 6:11. Notice it's often translated as destroy. It often has the sense of, and here it is in 9:18, destroy all flesh, but Sodom and Gomorrah, that story uses the same word for corrupt or destroy. And when you get into, farther down, even in Deuteronomy 4, beware lest you act corruptly by making a carved image. What I noticed when I looked at this myself earlier, this idea of corrupt is almost always related to some kind of other god story. So whether it be the worship of demons or the worship of other gods, you're acting corruptly when you worship other gods. And so the point is, it's a very severe word. It's not a small thing like, people weren't recycling their plastic, so God's upset. No, this is huge. The earth was corrupt in God's sight, probably having to do with not just behavior, but the worship of these other beings, these divine beings who have come down and cohabited with women. And the earth was filled with violence. Again, a very strong word. So anything else you want to say about 6:11?
Well, it just even some of the etymology about the word corrupt, like it also involves the imagery of use of destructive power. Like there's use of excessive might and power. And so there is this, it probably might be what helped feed into some of the ideas of the Enochian material of just essentially you're just seeing this idea of the use of power, of might, of strength, but in destructive manners, in ways that aren't life-giving. They're essentially, it's destroying through the consumption and just through just the exercise use of power in a way that is not beneficial to anything.
And in fact, it's repeated 4 times. Earth was corrupt. 6:12, corrupt. All flesh had. This is the same word in Hebrew, corrupted. And then in 6:13, I will shakat again. So corrupted is translated as destroyed there. But the violence.
It's interesting that it's the subject of the I is now referencing back to God. So so instead of being corrupt, he's actually using that power.
Oh, yeah. I will corrupt them. You corrupted mine, I'll corrupt them. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're trying to convey a little sense of difference between God's use of that power versus their use of the power.
Yeah. We're not going to read through the entire story, but you know where it goes if you've read the Bible before. You have the instructions of how to make the ark. It's about the size of a football stadium, including the end zones and length, 450 feet. So it's a huge thing. It's like the Metrodome before we tore it down up here. I often thought of it that way. Make a roof. He tells them how to make it and all, again, bringing all the animals in. Let's see. By the way, if we have tight genealogies again, for those of our listeners interested in a tight young Earth genealogy, the date of the flood would be 2458 BC. If again, these genealogies are tight. The son of Noah, Shem, would have been 98 years old at the date of the flood. So he was born before the story of the Nephilim gets going, but he is 98 when the flood happens. I was going to mention also, not on the screen here, but the idea of controlling the sea or the water was an aspect of divine power in the day of the early, the ancients. Psalm 29:10. Do I have it in front of me? I'm all going to grab it. The idea that God was in charge during the flood. The Lord sat enthroned at the flood, and the Lord sits as king forever. The idea that God is in control of the waters. The sea was often thought of as chaotic and the source of chaos in the world. So for God to control the sea and to control the water and thus flood the earth at his bidding would have been considered an act of sheer power in that day. So
and it kind of testifies to the different way that the Hebraic mindset about creation was compared to their neighbors, right? Because in the other ancient Near Eastern creation stories, the idea was that the creation gods had to battle. They had to fight these other like chaotic powers. And so they were almost like equal footing. And so who's going to turn out in the end? Who's going to win the battle? And yet here, the Hebraic mindset is pretty much, no, the seas are not on equal par with Yahweh. Instead, it's they're actually serving. He can control them.
Yeah,
and he's the one
that
yields it.
Yeah, And that's why he sits enthroned during the flood. He's actually recreating or decreating on his own terms his own world. So, and as everyone knows the story, Noah brings them in 2 by 2. They all join him there. It's his 600th year. Notice in 7:6, Noah was 600 years old at this point. The earth, of course, opens up for 40 days. It rains, and the waters of the deep burst forth. Verse 11, 7:11. Rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And then the waters continue, as it were, to go up for about 150. In fact, that's the last verse of 7. Let's go up to that one. The waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days, so half a year, really before the next part of the story, which I love this line. Again, it has the symbolism to it. God remembered Noah, like, oh, that's right, I have a guy in a boat. I better do something with him. And so God remembers Noah and all the beasts. He makes the wind blow, and it starts to abate. So it's verse 3, 8:3. At the end of 150, the waters begin to abate, and the way this is going to work is, of course, he'll eventually end up on Mount Ararat, which is in Syria area today. I think I'm forgetting. Turkey, modern day Turkey. By the way, there is some fascinating. For about 4 years running at ETS, they had a update on the summer, the previous summer's excavation, or what do you want to call it, up on the mountain of Ararat, trying to find Noah's Ark. And I forget where that all ended, but this is good biblical scholars, up there trying to do the work. And in other words, they believe the text, and they were doing soundings through this is deep ice up there. So whatever is up there, it's going to be buried in hundreds of feet of ice. But I don't know if you ever followed that, Mike, but it's an interesting story.
I saw it. I didn't get a chance to attend it. I know that there are people who are trying to dig or try to search and do all this kind of using the latest tech to kind of like just send sonar down.
Yeah, it's a sonar
see if they can detect something. Yeah. I think also just I don't know if this is just more of an aside, right? But whenever we read the word earth, we have to remember that it is the Hebrew word aretz, that's just simply land or ground.
Land.
Doesn't necessarily mean the entire globe.
Yeah, and so divine counsel worldview would not necessitate a worldwide flood. It could, but it doesn't, as Mike would himself say, it doesn't necessitate it. You could argue that this is a localized story written from Shinar or from Babylonian area, and because the next thing Abraham is going to be called out of that area. So maybe this is a local flood. It doesn't matter to me personally. I'm totally fine with a worldwide flood if that's what it is. But a lot of these things I like to give to God, as it were, and say I'm willing to wait. I've only got a couple more years, Mike, and I get to find out, right? But Noah sends out a raven, then he sends out a dove. One is a scavenger being, or a scavenger bird. The other one likes more clean things. That's why he sends them out the way he does. By the way, the Gilgamesh epic, if you've heard of that, really has a lot of, it's a Mesopotamian story, a poem. And Gilgamesh is this guy who is ordered to build an ark and such. And he also sends out a raven and a dove. And so my guess on that is not that one's copying the other as much as there is, and other tribes, other nations have had flood stories, in their past. My gut feeling, again, I'm really the last person to ask this material when it comes to, the archaeology of a flood. But my understanding is that when you have an event like this that takes place in the world, it's a historical event, that what you could predict would be numerous groups of people having this in their collective memory, whether orally or in writing. And so the fact that it happened, to me, is indicative of Noah's, story here, that this is the account that God is giving of the story, and that we're going to expect to find it in other people's writings as well. So finally, when you get, I just want to grab the main point here, verse 15. God said to Noah, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife, your sons, and so forth. And here is the key moment for me, verse 20, 8:20. Look at what he does. There is your loyalty factor kicking in. Noah built an altar to, and the next word is key. Which deity is he worshiping? You got to catch that when you see the word Lord. So he builds an altar to Yahweh. And he even, again, this is pre-law. So there's no, Levitical rules for how to offer sacrifices. So how did Noah know to do the every clean animal thing and the so forth? I think, again, this is just the world in which he lived, and that everyone would have done it this way at this time, that if you loved a deity, you worshiped him through the use of altars and sacrifices and such. And then, of course, this is very picturesque. Yahweh smells an aroma. He smells kind of weird that you'd smell burnt flesh and like it, but that's the story, right? Yahweh says in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. In other words, I've grown up with this idea that I'm going to be around humans that can be very wicked, but I'm making a promise that I'm never going to do this again. And so in the cycle of life, and I remember saying this when we saw this in the creation narrative, Genesis 1, I think what God is doing is just saying we're going back to the same story that I started with. In the original creation, we had a cycle of seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer. Death and life itself are part of the original creation. It's not a bad thing. And we're simply going back to that world. And including that back to the previous world idea, then comes Noah's command to multiply, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, which is, again, not for the first time that this has happened. In fact, all of these things I don't think started here. This is, again, not mandated by certainly me, but this is my gut feel that when God says the fear of you and the dread of you will be on every beast, he doesn't mean that prior to this, lions roamed, 2nd Street and would eat people at will. It just means that when you enter into your world where every living thing will be good food or will be food for you, but don't eat flesh with its blood. In verse 9:5 and 9:6, I was going to get to this too, that sometimes this has been taken to mean that God starts the idea of capital punishment. I really think that chapter 9, 1-6 are all saying, basically, and with the sign in the sky, verse 13 included, remember what he's going to say is, I'm going to put my rainbow in the cloud. The point is, he didn't invent rainbows at this time. I think what he's saying is, now that you get off the ark, I have recreated the world, as it were. We're going through a recreation story. And so everything that was going on before is going on now. And I want you to know that you're entering the same world in which we had before. Does that make sense? So, anything you want to add, Mike? I know we went through the flood story rather quickly, but I wasn't intending on reading it anyway.
Well, I think a few things, right? If folks are interested in looking at some of the related, cousin stories or sort of like other variant versions of like a flood narrative, right? I think years ago when people started digging and started finding that there were other ancient Near Eastern or Mesopotamian stories that looked similar to the Noah flood, almost like this very, very fast jump conclusion was that the Bible just simply copied them.
Right, which is stupid. I'm sorry for my choice of words, but why would you call a story that's copied? I'm sorry. Well, I should have let you finish your sentence, but go ahead.
Yeah, and so I think what it was, and I loved how over time, folks like Dr. Heiser and other scholars, they will, we shouldn't be afraid of the similarities. What we actually should be paying attention to are the differences, right? Because if these people, if the Israelites or later on the Hebrews, the Jewish people are living amongst other different people groups and they are sharing their stories and their ideas, that there would be similarities, but then there also would be nuances and changes that are purposely done. And one of the things I remember learning was that in one of the ancient Near Eastern versions of a flood, the concept of the flood was not because of wickedness or violence or decreation. It was simply because the gods were annoyed that human beings were making too much noise.
Interesting.
And that the concept of them wanting to wipe out humanity was because we were making too much noise. But then they hit an interesting problem after they started doing this. There were now no human beings to actually feed the gods. And so that by the time in their version, in one of these versions at the end, when the survivor of the flood comes out with his family and other animals, that the gods were so ravenously hungry because there were no other human beings to actually feed them, that doing the altar and offering a sacrifice, they needed humanity to feed them, which then makes it really kind of funny of like that the gods actually very haphazardly destroyed the very creatures that were meant to actually help feed them and continue their existence. But here, the difference is that Noah built an altar, made an offering, but God doesn't eat it.
Right. Yeah,
he enjoyed the aroma.
Clearly, I don't need him.
He saw the worship, and also, again, this is where also I would take a different spin, right? Because if this was literally, and if there were only literally 2 of each species left, then in verse 20, we're reading essentially Noah essentially caused the extinction of several different species all in the moment when he offers a sacrifice. We have to kind of just take that the story is as a story. It's not necessarily conveying a literal aspect of there were only 2 of each of these kinds left in the world. Yeah. In fact, because that would be depressing, to be honest.
It would be. Let's wrap up this edition then by just saying where we are in the story. Again, I am of a mindset that I have lived long enough in school and teaching that I'm tired of personally inspecting the gravel on the road. I would rather look up and see where the road's going and keep myself in the middle of that road and watch where the road is going and interpret the text based on the road, not the gravel. And so where are we in the gravel, not on the gravel, but where are we on the road? And here's my recommendation, and I'll let you bounce your thoughts off it, Mike. One God created the world. He also created humans and divine beings when he made creation, and those beings are like each other. We're made in the image of God, so that there is a unknown but fascinating responsiveness that goes on between humans and divine beings from the very beginning. Whether we feel it or not, we have the ear of divine beings and they have ours. Well, we have a pair that are given a job in a small hobby farm. They eat an apple they shouldn't. They get kicked out. They join the world of humans in the cycle of seed time and harvest, day and night, dying and living. And the important point to catch is that the worship of Yahweh, which started apparently with Adam and Eve, took a dive for a chapter with the line of Cain, but was resurrected with Enosh. Enosh's line eventuates in Noah, and God, and then again, just the story shows us that there is some kind of a movement of the divine world to get involved with humanity again, and for a period of maybe 120 some years, there's this mess going on that God finally puts his foot down and says, I'm starting over. And so coming off the ark are 8 people. I would recommend they're all Yahwists based on the reason that we had the story was to get rid of the non-Yahwism that's happening. And so coming off the ark, I would presume we would have Yahwists. Now, again, you can read the end of 10 or 9 and make your judgment on Ham and Canaan. We might touch on that next time, but that's where I am in the story. The bigger story. God has started over, and the issue was, are people worshiping me or not? That's the big one, and God's going to work forward from there.
I think that's fair, and I would want to add in that it is significant that in chapter 9, verse 1, God essentially gives the same mandate that it was given in chapter 1 of being fruitful and multiplying or increase, as the NIV would say. It's as though Noah was another version, or like an Adam revisited.
Yeah. Fair enough. And I mean, obviously he gets off the ark, and I remember one of the Targums talk about, he's looking around, there's these clay humans, are baked in the clay. I mean, it's a mess. And that again would be a midrash on the story, but I can imagine you get off the ark, and it's usually in the storybooks, it's all pristine and you got a rainbow in the background, but you probably have a world of clay and mud that you're going to have to work through. And that's why be fruitful and multiply would not be a surprising way to begin the story for them. So let's pick it up next time. The important thing to catch then coming into next time is that at this time of the world history, there's one family. They speak one language, and there's no sense that you get that they're going to try to head off in their own directions. They're going to stay together. And so one family, begins the story over again, and we'll see where it goes from there. Mm-hmm. I'm good if you are, Mike.
I am. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And
thank you, everyone. I hope it's been helpful to, again, keep your mind on the text and where the story's going. So we'll see you next time.